Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to those that have joined us in this very warm afternoon for this panel on sustainable transitions in Sub-Saharan Africa's hot and arid lands. So very topical considering the weather. So I'm Lorna Ritchie. I'm climate change, such as drought and desertification, and more and more people and on their infrastructure. So we need could be adopted to achieve this transition and expand sustainable cities. So just before we get started, there will be an opportunity at the end for questions after the panel, but I'd also like to just flag that there's going to be a call for prayer at 3:08. So we'll pause for a bit while that happens. But to get us started, I'd like to welcome Sandile Mambatha, Senior Manager at Etequini Municipality, who's going to talk us through the work that you've been doing there.
A very good afternoon. Thank you, Lorna, and thank you, colleagues, for braving the heat to come and listen to what I'm going to share. Is there. So I've got three purposes today. One of them is to offend those who love cities and slightly offend those who work for the state. And I have a currency to do that because I work for government myself. And I'm going to bring you a little bit of hope and suggestion on terms of what can be done in terms of driving or supporting sustainable transitions. So my name is Sandile. I work for city of Etequini in South Africa. We are located in the eastern seaboard of the Indian Ocean in South Africa. So we list popular. So there's Cape Town, Joburg, and it's ourselves very often. So I said there's three things. One is to contextualize cities, and by so doing and highlighting some of the complexities of cities, I'm going to offend a lot of those people who are proponents of cities as places of opportunities. I'm going to talk about the complexity of local government, particularly from the political side, which makes it very, very difficult to innovate or to create policies that allow for innovation so that you can drive sustainable transitions. And I'm going to talk about data as infrastructure, and that's something that's very close to my heart, that there is no decision, or at least there should be no decision made without data, without insight. If you continue to make those kind of decisions, then you will be in trouble. So I start by saying that my contention is that cities are places of inequality. What you see is a photo in South Africa that demonstrates this inequality. I think the screen doesn't really show very well. But cities are also places of overconsumption, and as a result, they generate a lot of waste. But also they're a concentration of poverty. I grew up in a rural, northern part of KZN in South Africa, in a rural community. I had never in my life seen a homeless person or someone who's begging or an orphan who had no home. But moving to cities, I saw a lot of those. And I travel a lot of cities. I know that in London there's a lot of homeless people. I know that in Hamburg there is. I know that in many, many cities of the world there is. But I also know that cities are facing rapid, unplanned urbanization. I think that's important because urbanization is important and it's critical, but unplanned urbanization becomes a problem. There's unplanned population growth that we have no way of figuring them out. As a result of these, there's a proliferation of informal settlement that creates another set of challenges that we face in cities. There's an increasing demand on basic services. People need water, people need sanitation. I'm going to highlight an example of what happens when the demand comes in cities, especially cities like ourselves in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a decreasing financial muscle and capacity at local government because people are unemployed, so they can't pay rates. Businesses can't stay in these cities, so we don't have enough money to be able to do things that we are supposed to do. There's increasing service delivery protest, and I'm not sure whether other cities face this. On average in South Africa, in Durban in particular, it's a city of 4 million people. We have about 20 protests. So that's on average 1 protest per working day. And in total, we have roughly about 240 protests annually. And those protests are service delivery related protests where people want water, people want sanitation. There's increasing health hazards and exposure to climate disasters. And this all happens in cities. So I think I've offended a lot of people who love cities and they think of cities as places of opportunity. And I've deliberately gone into challenges that are brought by cities. If we recognize and accept that in cities, these challenges exist within cities. And the question is, why are cities not part of these global conversations around climate change? Why are they coming in as, by the way, cities, but national governments are having those, are part and leading those negotiations? So the contention is saying that cities need to be in the forefront of climate change negotiations. They need to be in the forefront of any sustainability conversations, because nations talk, as we know, and cities do. I might lose my job when I go back because we report to national government and provincial government. So I'm prepared for that. So the next one is the complex and sort of dynamic political environment. I always contend that by design, local government is designed to fail. In order to buy a pen in local government, you have to have 1,000 signatures. In order to introduce a project, you need to negotiate your way around some of the political sentiments, ensuring that you don't bruise anyone politically in order to make a decision. So I'm wondering, how do you leapfrog? And my colleagues and the organizers were asking me questions around the possibilities of leapfrogging in terms of technology, how you delivered technology before. How do you explain to political leadership that you want to leapfrog a process they know that often creates jobs, so that you deal with the issues of sustainability and you deliver services in a different way? So this context is extremely important, and we work within that context. There's a rigidity, is a rigid institution, so the policies and legislative framework are extremely rigid in the manner of how the services need to be delivered. There's a certain way, certain bylaws and policies that says this is how you need to do a project. And the project must have employment opportunities. So if you're not digging and employing 50 people, and you're saying, no, it's because I want to leapfrog and do things differently so I can be more sustainable, politicians say, well, we need employment. So you imagine a lot of cities, especially in Africa, are dealing with those issues of balancing some of the socio-economic imperatives and sustainability issues. Which choice do you make if you work for government? There's limited or no appetite for innovation. Because the term of office of many of our politicians is 5 years, and sustainability is a long game. How do you balance the two? When political leadership says, my people have been protesting because they need water, and you're saying we are looking at alternative ways to supply water that will help us leapfrog the old sort of traditional infrastructure, and that's going to take us another 5 years for us to have a trial and error. How do you justify that in such a complex political context? There are competing demands for resources that, again, are symbolic of that friction between the administration and the politics of cities. How do you navigate that in our context? The limited political will to deal with issues of sustainability, again, that links to the short-termism of the politics that exist in local government of the 5-year term. Sustainability, like I said, is a long-term goal, and it's a long game. How do you balance the two? And I'm posing these questions to yourselves because you're an academic. I'm a recovering academic, so I left the space. I just probably wasn't good enough. I work for public service, so I would love to hear more of those questions. But I'll make examples of how we've navigated some of those. So the last section, the organizers had told me that they'll stop me within 10 minutes, and I requested that they don't. I find time as a colonial creation, so I'll spend as much as I can. Not really. I think I'm doing okay with time. As I mentioned earlier, data is a critical infrastructure for sustainable transitions. No decision should be made without knowing the past, the current, and the future. And in fact, sustainability transition is not even possible without data that guides you in terms of how you move forward. There's a couple of things that when I was preparing this presentation, was thinking about that are almost impossible to do without data. You cannot, without data, know who your government and how local government functions and how people move in and out of cities. In the city of eThekwini is firstly recognizing that data is a critical infrastructure, the decisions we've been making that are based on political instinct and some political sentiments, and sometimes being pushed by circumstances to make certain infrastructure decision, resource allocation decision. So we've shifted to saying, how do we center cities and sub-Saharan cities at disadvantage in terms of the quality of data they get, while there is data that's available, but it's extremely expensive to access. So what we've created is what we call but perhaps what most important that comes out of here, of this single source of truth, is what we call a Green Book MetroView tool. Working with Center for Scientific Research in South Africa, the CSIR. We work with a couple of other stakeholders.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, this is a very big question, you know. I don't think I can attempt it, but I will try to act as though I can attempt it. Basically, close that. Number one is productivity of animals. It's a false assumption to say nomadic animals are non-productive. It's actually the guy when he talked about the date trees, you know, and etc. And the whole dependence on ethnobotany, the livestock walking.
Drawn boundaries around them and what goes on in, and the growing built-up boundary of the city. And that mismatch gives rise to many of the problems and the complexities that have already been alluded to other high-income countries, Bifus Bay and Luderitz, and the northern Cape of South Africa. And then if you go up the east coast, you get to places like Mogadishu, and inland there are many others. So again, it's highly diverse, and the issues, the challenges, the priorities for sustainable transitions in those will differ, just as they will by city size. The opportunities and constraints I mentioned in large cities, multi-million, and that's where the comparative dimension can come in. Whether we're comparing climate change policies at the city scale, which was a study I did with colleagues in Cape Town and Greater Manchester, and where despite the enormous geopolitical differences of North and South, they have many similarities and face very similar challenges of trying to identify appropriate resources, to build political coalitions to lead on this, to identify champions in key departments of the respective municipalities or co-production way. And the interest...
You mentioned the role of governments, either national, local, or internationally. What is...
Very good example in Ethiopia, for instance, you know, there's actually, it's stated in the constitution that land rights, that sort of livestock support.
What would you like to see?
Were still colonial possessions, and I use that term deliberately, and didn't have a vote at the table. They do now have votes, but the structure and the imbalance be part of the discussion as of, in effect, right, rather than some sort of concessionary by your leave, is fundamental to it. There are other stakeholders as well. I mean, the whole of the global SD agenda, Sustainable Development Agenda, is written through with multi-stakeholder partnerships, and global aggregates and averages is never going to do the trick. It's having...
an ever-present theme when it comes...
resonates with Sandele's comment about having been born and grown up in a rondavel, which is a mud hut with this central pole, and made of mud and daub with generally, in the traditional form anyway, a thatched roof of one form or another. Well, I've been working in and on Namibia, which is an arid and semi-arid country, for a long, long time, and during the transition to independence in 1989, fringes of the high-density, low-income so-called townships, because Windhoek, although it was in Namibia, was built in the image of South Africa's apartheid cities, started building either rondavels in the style just described, or rectangular hybrid, use local materials that are cheaper than the fashionable imported ones, are also much more suited to this kind of environment than sitting under a thin metal roof and having to have air conditioning, or in most cases just suffering in silence because there's no electricity. Right, I think we can resume.
Pause for suspense.
Anyway, she was totally stuck in what I call the modernist trap, the obsession with modern building materials that were factory made of a standard that was unaffordable to the vast majority of the urban poor, and failed or refused to understand why, despite a few heated conversations and attempted explanations, this could actually be a key part of the solution to rapid rural to urban migration, which was accelerating towards the end of South Africa's rule in Namibia and the restrictions on rural urban migration that had characterized the bulk of it. And instead, she forced the demolition of these.
International research is important. UK students by international students, it gives you an idea that, and you see, we could use that opportunity working together. So why not us? I mean, are we so daft that we cannot even generate knowledge here internally? For instance, what do you think this is where we are? Do you think, what is this architecture, man? Why we have a tent like this? It's a tent, isn't it? Do you know it's a nomadic tent?